At my citizenship ceremony, I scanned a crowd of 500 people. Everyone else had family, cameras, flowers. My own parents refused to come. They'd opposed my immigration from the beginning. I stood completely alone until an elderly woman in the back row rose from her seat, holding a handmade sign with my name painted in bright blue letters. When I approached her afterward, she told me she'd been doing this for 11 years, celebrating strangers, becoming the family that never showed up. Her name is Dorothy. She's 73 years old, and in 11 years, she has attended over 200 citizenship ceremonies for complete strangers. But the story of why she started, and what happened when she met Maria that afternoon, is about something much deeper than a single act of kindness. It's about a promise she made to a man who never got to become a citizen himself. That man was her husband, Samuel. A refugee who fled political violence in Guatemala, built a life in Cleveland for 23 years, and died of a heart attack 3 weeks before his own citizenship interview. Dorothy never got to watch him hold that little American flag, so she started showing up for other people's husbands, other people's daughters. I learned all of this later. On the day of my ceremony, I knew none of it. I only knew that my own family had made their position painfully clear. I grew up in a small farming town outside San Pedro Sula, Honduras. My parents ran a modest hardware store. When I told them I was applying for a U.S. visa, my mother set her coffee cup down so hard the handle cracked. "You are abandoning this family," she said. Not a question, a verdict. My father didn't even look up from his newspaper. I left anyway. I arrived in Miami at 24 years old with $200 and a cousin who let me sleep on her floor for 3 months. I worked double shifts at a laundromat. I learned English from soap operas with Spanish subtitles. I paid my taxes. I stayed out of trouble. Year after year, I climbed through the system legally, patiently, the way they tell you to. When I finally passed my citizenship test, I called my mother. I thought maybe this would change things. Almost a decade had passed. I was becoming an American, something so many people in my town dreamed about. I invited them to fly up for the ceremony. I even offered to pay. Click. That was her answer. The morning of November 2nd, I put on a red blouse I'd bought specifically for this day. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and practiced smiling. I told myself it didn't matter, that I was doing this for me, that I didn't need anyone in the audience. The ceremony was held at a convention center downtown. 500 new citizens from 63 countries. When I walked in, the first thing I saw was a Filipino family of 12, spilling across an entire row, waving a flag. To my left, a young man from Ghana was surrounded by people hugging him so tightly he could barely breathe. Everywhere I looked, someone was holding flowers, someone was recording on a phone, someone was crying happy tears into a relative's shoulder. I sat in my assigned seat, a plastic chair near the middle of the hall. A woman next to me had her husband and her mother beside her, taking photos. I had an empty seat on either side. The judge began calling names in alphabetical order. Rodriguez, Santos, Torres. One by one, new citizens rose and walked toward the stage, greeted by bursts of applause from their families. I gripped the edge of my chair. The program said there were 3 names between Santos and me. When they finally called Maria Elena Vega, I stood. The walk to the front felt like crossing a football field. I could hear my own heels on the linoleum. I glanced at the crowd, scanning the rows of faces for anyone who looked like home. No one, just polite clapping from strangers. Then, at the very back of the hall, movement caught my eye. An elderly white woman I had never seen before was rising from her seat. She was holding something against her chest, a piece of poster board. She turned it around so I could read the words. The sign read, in careful hand-painted letters, FELICIDADS Maria Vega. My name, my full name. She had painted it in blue and green, the colors of the Honduran flag with a small star in the corner. I stopped mid-step. The judge called my name again, and I had to force my legs to carry me the rest of the way. I received my certificate. I mumbled the oath of allegiance. I shook hands with officials whose names I would never remember. But the entire time, my eyes kept drifting back to that old woman in the back row, holding a sign like she'd come to pick up a long-lost relative from the airport. After the ceremony, the hall erupted into a chaos of embraces and camera flashes. I stood against the wall, clutching my citizenship folder, watching the families cascade past me. Then a soft voice appeared at my elbow. "You looked like you needed someone," she said. Up close, she was small and slightly stooped, with wispy white hair and startlingly clear blue eyes. She wore a cardigan with embroidered flowers along the collar. The sign was propped against her hip. "I'm Dorothy," she said, "and I'll be the first to tell you, welcome home." I didn't know what to say. I had prepared myself to be alone that day. I had braced for the silence. I had not prepared for kindness from a stranger. She must have seen tears threatening because she put her hand on my arm with surprising steadiness. "Let's get some coffee. You need to sit down, and I have a story you deserve to hear." We found a diner 2 blocks from the convention center. Over bad coffee and a shared slice of apple pie, Dorothy told me about Samuel. He was a carpenter from Quetzaltenango. He fled Guatemala in 1982 at the peak of the Civil War after his brother disappeared. He arrived in Cleveland with nothing, worked construction for a decade, met Dorothy at a bus stop in the rain. They married in 1993. She was 44. He was 46. Neither had ever believed love would find them so late. For 23 years, they built a life in a small blue house on the west side. Samuel fixed everything himself. The porch, the plumbing, the gutters. He never missed a day of work. He applied for citizenship 3 times, and 3 times the process stalled in bureaucracy. Finally, in 2016, he received his interview date, October 4th. He was going to become a citizen at age 70. Dorothy decorated the house with American flags. She bought a cake from the bakery where he'd learned to order in English. On September 11th, Samuel died. A heart attack in the driveway while loading his toolbox into the truck. He never even made it to the interview. Dorothy buried him in a cemetery plot she could see from their kitchen window. After the funeral, she sat alone in that blue house, surrounded by flags that would never wave at his ceremony. Then she remembered something he used to say. In this country, nobody should have to stand alone. That was his philosophy. He'd help neighbors he barely knew shovel driveways for elderly couples down the street, fix a stranger's screen door if he noticed it hanging crooked. He believed in showing up. So Dorothy decided to show up. She called the immigration office, asked when the next naturalization ceremony was, and simply attended. She brought a sign that read, "Congratulations, someone is proud of you." The first time, she didn't even know who it was for. She just sat in the back and held it up for whoever needed to see it. That was 11 years ago. She's done it at least once a month ever since. I sat in that diner, gripping my coffee cup, trying to absorb what she was telling me. This woman had driven 3 hours from Cleveland to Columbus that morning. She had researched the ceremony online, pulled up the list of new citizens, and picked me. She said she chose people who didn't have a full row of guests listed. She said the system allows you to register guests ahead of time, and when she saw my name with no registrants, she knew. I asked her why she kept doing it. She touched the locket around her neck. Because Samuel should have had someone cheering for him. And he didn't get that, so I'm going to make sure as many people as possible do. That's the promise I made. Then she slid her phone across the table and showed me a photo album. Hundreds of faces. A woman from Syria, beaming next to Dorothy. A young man from Ghana, holding his certificate and her sign. 2 sisters from Ukraine, their arms wrapped around her narrow shoulders. An elderly gentleman from Vietnam who had invited her to his family's celebration afterward. There were candid shots, selfies, newspaper clippings. She knew every name. She remembered every ceremony. I started crying in the diner, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming collision of 2 truths. That my own family had purposefully abandoned me on the most important day of my life, and that a complete stranger had rearranged her entire day to make sure I wasn't alone. I finally checked my phone. There were no missed calls, no messages from Honduras. I had sent my mother the date and address weeks ago. I had sent a follow-up email the night before, telling her again how much I wished they could be there. Nothing, but there was one message. From my cousin in San Pedro Sula, the one who had sided with my parents years ago. It read, "Mommy says to tell you she saw your Facebook post about the ceremony. She says you look very American now. She hopes it was worth it." I showed it to Dorothy. She read it without flinching. "Some families have a harder time letting go than others," she said. "That's not your burden to carry. Your job now is to build the family that shows up." She pulled out a small notebook from her purse and wrote down her phone number. "I come to these ceremonies regularly, but I also believe in follow-through. If you ever need advice, a listening ear, or just someone who remembers Samuel and understands why these moments matter, you call me." I tucked the paper into my citizenship folder next to my certificate. By the time I looked up, she had paid the check and was putting on her coat. She walked me to the parking lot where the late afternoon sun was turning the clouds gold. Before she got into her old Honda, she hugged me. Not a polite, distant hug, a real one. The kind my mother had not given me in 10 years. "Next year," she said, "there's a ceremony on November 2nd. Same place. I'll be there. If you're ready, you could come hold a sign with me." That night, alone in my apartment, I pinned my citizenship certificate to the wall above my desk. Next to it, I hung the sign Dorothy had painted. The blue and green letters, the little star. I stared at it until the tears came again, but this time they were something else entirely. Not grief, not anger. Something that felt like the first solid ground after years of shifting sand. And then my phone rang. It was my mother. And then my phone rang. It was my mother. I stared at the screen, her photo from 2008 still lighting up, the one where she's smiling beside my father at my cousin's wedding. 3 rings, I answered. "So you went through with it," she said. No greeting, no question, a flat pronouncement. "You really believe you are American now? You think a piece of paper makes you belong?" I couldn't speak. She continued, her voice tightening into something I'd never heard before, not anger, but contempt. "Your father says you are dead to us. He asked me not to call. I called anyway to tell you myself. You chose that country over this family. Enjoy your certificate." Click. She hung up. No goodbye, just the emptiness of a disconnected line. I stood in my apartment, the phone pressed to my ear, listening to nothing. The sign on the wall, Dorothy's hand-painted blue and green letters, suddenly looked enormous. I had been disowned by the people who were supposed to celebrate this day with me. Not because I'd done something wrong, but because I'd fulfilled a dream they never wanted me to have. I didn't cry right away. I called Dorothy. It was nearly 10 at night, but she answered on the second ring. "Maria, are you okay?" I just needed to hear a voice that wasn't furious at me for existing. She was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to give you my address. Come tomorrow, whatever time you can. There's something I need to show you." The next day, I drove 3 hours to Cleveland. The blue house was smaller than I'd imagined, with a porch that listed slightly to the left and a hand-painted mailbox with a tiny Guatemalan flag decal beside the number. Dorothy met me at the door, wearing the same cardigan from the ceremony, and led me inside. The house was a museum of careful love. Photographs of Samuel lined the hallway. Samuel at a work site, hammer in hand. Samuel holding a cake on his 60th birthday. Samuel reading on the porch. But what stopped me cold was the wall in the living room. A framed document hung next to a small candle. It wasn't a citizenship certificate. It was Samuel's appointment notice from USCIS, dated September 15, 2016. His photograph was clipped to the corner, a tired but hopeful man in his 60s. Underneath, Dorothy had added a handwritten card. "You would have been magnificent." "He never even got to walk into the room," Dorothy said, standing beside me. The interview was at 9. He was out cold in the driveway by 8:15. I felt a wave of something unnameable, not just grief for a man I'd never met, but recognition. Someone else had been abandoned by fate, not by a phone call, but by time itself. I asked her how she survived the months after. She didn't answer right away. She went to the kitchen, filled a kettle, set it on the stove. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a small velvet bag. From it, she removed a gold locket. She handed it to me. Inside was a photo of Samuel, the same one from the appointment letter. On the opposite side, folded into a tiny square, was a piece of paper. I unfolded it carefully. It was a handwritten copy of the Oath of Allegiance. Samuel had practiced it, she said, every night for weeks. He'd written it out 10 times, trying to memorize every word. This was the final copy, the one he'd planned to recite during the ceremony. The paper was soft from handling. Dorothy's voice dropped. "He never spoke those words, not officially, so I say them for him at every ceremony I attend. I stand in the back and whisper the oath while the new citizens take theirs. It's the only way I know to finish his story." I looked up from the locket. Dorothy's eyes were dry, but her chin trembled slightly. "That's why I chose you, Maria. Your name had no one. Samuel would have hated that, and I hate it too." We spent the rest of the afternoon at the kitchen table, drinking tea and talking about the family I'd lost. I told her about my mother's final words, about my father's rejection, about the years of silence that preceded it. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "They didn't lose a daughter because you got citizenship. They lost a daughter because they couldn't see that loving your country and loving your family aren't enemies. That was their failure, not yours." Then she made me an offer. In 6 months, there would be another ceremony at the convention center. She'd already looked up the list. A man from Ethiopia, Abeb, had 0 registered guests. "I want you to come with me," she said. I want you to hold a sign for him. You don't have to know his story. You just have to show up. I said I'd think about it. But as I drove home that night, I knew I'd already decided. The sign on my wall wasn't just a reminder of being seen. It was an invitation to see others. Dorothy had transformed her grief into a promise, and now that promise was passing to me. That was when I finally understood something that changed everything. My family's abandonment wasn't an ending. It was the opening through which an entirely new idea of family could enter. A family not bound by blood or obligation, but by deliberate choice. By the decision to show up for strangers simply because they need someone. By the belief that no one should stand alone on the most important day of their life. I called Dorothy the next morning. "I'll be there," with a sign. But first, I had to prepare. And I had no idea that the next ceremony would reveal a secret she'd kept even from me, one that would rewrite all the years she'd been showing up. 6 months later, on the morning of May 8th, I parked in the same convention center lot where Dorothy had found me. This time, I wasn't wearing a red blouse I'd bought to impress no one. I was wearing a soft gray sweater, comfortable, practical. I had a sign in my passenger seat. It read, CONGRATULATIONSABB in careful block letters with the Ethiopian flag painted in the corner. I'd spent 3 nights working on it, relearning how to hold a paintbrush without shaking. Dorothy met me at the entrance. She was holding her own sign already prepared, but this one was generic. She'd left a Beb's name to me. "You're on time," she said, smiling. "That's better than I did my first time." I was 20 minutes late and had to sneak in during the pledge. We walked together into the hall, past the families with balloons, past the children in dress clothes, past the same Filipino family I remembered from my own ceremony. Here again for a cousin this time. I recognized the matriarch's flowered dress. Abeb was easy to spot. He sat in the 3rd row, a slender man in his 40s with graying temples and the posture of someone who had spent years bracing for disappointment. He had 0 guests, not a single person in the seats around him. He was staring straight ahead, hands folded, as the judge began the roll call. When they announced his full name, Abeb Kebed Tatus, he stood slowly, like a man who had learned not to expect applause. I raised the sign. My arms trembled, not from the weight, but from the sudden understanding that I was now on the other side of this. I was the person who had decided to show up for a stranger. Dorothy stood beside me, her hand briefly touching my elbow. Abeb's eyes found us in the back row. He stopped walking. For a moment, his face was utterly unreadable. Then his shoulders dropped and a smile cracked through, small, disbelieving, as if someone had handed him a gift he didn't know how to open. He finished his walk to the stage. He took the oath. He received his certificate. And when the ceremony ended, he made a straight line toward us, past the families and the photographers, holding his folder against his chest like something precious. "Who are you?" he asked. His accent was thick, his voice hoarse. "Do I know you?" "No," I said, "but someone once did this for me, and I promised to pay it forward." His eyes filled. He tried to speak, couldn't, and simply shook my hand for a long time. His grip said everything. His wife and children were still in Addis Ababa, he explained later. They were waiting for him to stabilize his immigration status so they could join him. That moment, being cheered by strangers, would be the story he told them when they finally reunited. Afterward, Dorothy and I sat on a bench outside the convention center. The spring air was cool and clean. She was quiet, more reflective than usual. I asked her if something was wrong. "No," she said. "I'm just thinking about how it started." Not with me. I didn't understand. She turned to face me, and her eyes had the same steadiness they'd held when she first approached me in that diner. "The first time I held a sign at a ceremony wasn't 11 years ago," she said. "It was 12, and it wasn't my idea." She told me the full story then. After Samuel died, she fell into a depression so deep she didn't leave the house for 8 months. She lost weight. She stopped answering the phone. One morning, her neighbor Edith, a widow in her 80s who lived 3 doors down, knocked and refused to leave until Dorothy opened the door. Edith had been a naturalized citizen herself, having fled Austria during the war. She'd attended her own ceremony alone in 1953, and she'd never forgotten the loneliness of standing in a room full of celebration with no one to celebrate her. Edith had learned about Samuel's unfinished citizenship. She had an idea. She dragged Dorothy to a ceremony in Akron, handed her a piece of poster board, and said, "Hold this up. You're not going to feel better until you give away what you wanted for yourself." Dorothy held the sign that day, and the next month, and the month after. When Edith died 3 years later, Dorothy continued alone. She never told anyone the full origin because, she said, the story wasn't about her. It was about a chain of women who had each stood alone in a room meant for celebration, and who had each decided no one else should have to. Edith passed the sign to me, Dorothy said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a small, folded rectangle of poster board, faded, creased, edges soft. On it, in handwriting I didn't recognize, were the words, "Someone is glad you're here." This was the first sign. She held it at a ceremony for a Korean family in 1954. I've kept it folded in my purse at every ceremony since, and now I'm passing it to you. I took the sign. It was light, worn, impossibly fragile for something that had carried so much weight. I realized then that my citizenship ceremony had not been the end of a journey. It had been an induction. The family I'd lost had refused to show up for me, but in doing so, they had made room for a family that stretched back 70 years, Edith, Dorothy, Samuel, and now me. I drove home with the old sign on my passenger seat. My phone buzzed halfway. It was a number I hadn't seen in a year, my father's. I let it ring. Then I pulled over, took a breath, and listened to the voicemail. "Iris, I'm sorry." His voice was strained, unfamiliar. "Your mother," she passed last night. "She wanted to hear your voice. I'm so sorry, Mija. I know I. The message cut off. I sat on the side of the highway, the engine idling, holding the phone and the folded sign from a woman I'd never met. My mother was gone. The woman who'd told me I was dead to her had died with my name on her lips. And the man who'd disowned me had called to say he was sorry. I didn't know what I felt. Not yet. That would take months. But I knew what I had to do. I called Dorothy. She answered, and I told her everything. She didn't offer solutions. She didn't tell me it was okay. She just said, "I'm here. When you're ready, we'll talk about what comes next." That was a year ago. And what came next is this. I still hold signs at citizenship ceremonies. I've held them for new citizens from 17 countries. I've seen faces of relief, confusion, joy, and disbelief. I've learned the names of people who had not heard their own names spoken with excitement in years. And every time I stand in the back of that hall, holding a poster for a stranger, I think of Samuel, who never got his ceremony. Of Edith, who started a chain she would never see the end of. Of my mother, whose last word was my name. And of the truth that finally caught up to me on the side of that highway. Family isn't always the people who are supposed to show up. Sometimes it's the people who choose to. And sometimes the deepest belonging comes from the people who find you in an empty row and raise a sign with your name on it. That's the thing about showing up. It never starts with you. Dorothy didn't start this. Edith didn't start this. Someone, somewhere, probably holding a sign we'll never know about, stood in the back of a room because they couldn't stand the thought of a stranger being invisible on the day their life changed. And that one decision set off a quiet chain of belonging that has been running for 70 years. I didn't know any of this when I walked into my citizenship ceremony feeling abandoned. I thought the story was about what I had lost, but the real story was about what I inherited. An invitation. Not just to be seen, but to see. Not just to be loved, but to choose who you love deliberately with paint and poster board and a 3-hour drive on a Tuesday morning. So I want to ask you the same question Dorothy asked me. Who showed up for you when no one else did? Or maybe the harder question, has there been a moment when you could have shown up for someone else and didn't? Tell me in the comments. I read every one of them. If this story meant something to you, share it with someone who needs to hear that family can be built, not just inherited. Check the description for more stories like this. And if you haven't subscribed yet, I hope you will. There are a lot of people out there still standing in empty rows. Let's see them.